To introduce in this discussion Jason Blake. Hello, Jason.
Hi, Ricardo.
Hello, good afternoon. David Benning.
Hi,
Hello,
Ricardo.
David.
Hi, how are you? Jason, how are you?
Fine.
Hi, David.
And
Good.
finally, Ian Barker. Hello, Ian. Ian, can you hear us?
Hello, Ricardo. Pleasure to be here.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to leave you guys.
I can.
I'm going to leave you guys and I'm going to be back in 45 minutes. Okay, Jason, don't forget, 45 minutes is all we got to have this discussion, because we're having another panel right after this one. Okay, guys, see you in a bit. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Ricardo. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. So today's topic we're going to talk about is, are the best North American players playing in state, provincial, high performance leagues? And in order to debate and discuss this topic, we're joined by Ian Barker, who is the Director of Coaching Education at the United Soccer Coaches. And we're also joined by Dave Benning, who is the Director of Soccer Operations at Pickering Football Club. Before we carry on, I just wanted actually to hand over to Dave very quickly, just as he wants to just make a short statement.
Jason, thanks very much. On behalf of so many in our sport, I'd like to thank the people in the medical services and all of those on the front line, essential workers who are trying to keep our lives as normal as possible during this unprecedented time. Our condolences from everyone in our sport goes out to all those who have been affected by COVID-19 and have lost loved ones.
Thanks, Dave. Before we move on, we will monitor the and if any questions come through, we'll bring those into the discussion at the moment. Really, I think just to start, it would probably be good just for, as Ian, you're based in the States and you're based in Canada, just make a short summary of what the high performance looks like in your environment. So if we start with... Do you
want some coffee?
Okay, Jason, would you mind to ask the question again, please?
No problem. So, Ian, just probably the best thing to do is to start by explaining the current structures of the high performance leagues within both of our relevant countries. So David, you're in Canada, Ian's in the US. So David, I can't see Ian on the screen right now. So if we start with you from the Canadian point of view.
Sure. Well, one of the things about in Canada now is that most of the provinces are trying to make an attempt to have a standard-based league where every club is being asked to elevate their level of professionalism in regards to organization and program information, to technical and supporting criteria, to administration and finances, to infrastructure and governance. And it's really to get the clubs organized in best practices, to be do due diligence on the field and off the field, administratively and technically. And I know that I can speak more about what's happening in Ontario. And the basis is the fact that Ontario Player Development League is the top league that is based in Ontario. Then there are the regional leagues, which would be the Central Soccer League and Golden Horseshoe League, that I'm aware of the two. There are more. And then you have the district leagues, which are over 20 of them that every club is associated with. So it moves from at U13, where clubs can apply to their regional league and qualify to play in there. And there are licenses that have been handed out to clubs that have applied and met the criteria to play in the Ontario Player Development League. So basically, we're set up in that situation right now, and it's becoming more apparent that every province is trying to do the same thing, from Vancouver all the way to Newfoundland. I believe that Vancouver has moved in the direction and more prepared to play. I believe that Quebec is already on certain standards, and hopefully it will lead to an opportunity for the best in Ontario play against the best in Quebec and the best in the West for a national championship one day, but we're not quite there yet. Everything is still in an early development stage.
Thanks, David. It looks like we might be losing Ian on and off for a little bit, so I'm going to keep you for now.
Sure.
So just to cover the male and female game, how does that look different within the structure that you just described, or is it the same?
Well, right now in Canada, it's the basis that, you know, we try to treat both genders of equality and giving them the same opportunities. Obviously, the men's game is more developed at the top end at the professional level, and the pathways change. But from grassroots up to at least U18, perhaps U21 to senior, where we in Ontario we have League One, it's basically the same structure for both sides. And I don't think it should be any different. I think female players should have the same opportunity as the men. It's just unfortunate when we get to the opportunity to get paid to play a game that you love and you have the ability, that it's more available to the men than the women. But basically, from the structures of U13 up in the Elite League, we're aligned with the Provincial Association. We're aligned with the national vision to push the format that the national team programs are using to be 4-3-3. And as we get into the ages of 15 through 17, we have a mandate to try to implement 2 other types of formations and styles of play that allows every club to have an identity of their game model, their playing philosophy, their coach education program. So at first it used to be just a 4-3-3, but I think it's nice that it's elevated or evolved to allowing clubs to have an identity.
Thanks, David. It looks like we've got Ian back. So
Yeah.
Ian, I'll throw it straight over to you. David's just explained the current high-performance league picture in Canada.
Sure.
I'm wondering if you might be able to summarise how that looks in the equivalent for
Absolutely, and I apologise to everybody. We had a great connection with Portugal and Canada, and then all of a sudden I had no connection with anybody. So everything changed in the US literally last night. Last night, US soccer, or people are reporting that US soccer has disbanded the Development Academy League that it was running for boys and girls. So I'll explain what that was, and I'll explain what it looks like based on information that's only about 12 hours old. And so some of you in Canada are hearing about this for the first time, and certainly around the country. When I first came to this country in the 80s, obviously a lot of the elite players were being pulled from the US college system. So if you look at the 1990 World Cup squad, that was pretty much recent collegians. And in 1994, when we hosted the World Cup, players like Alexi Lalas, who went on to play in Serie A, had never actually been professionals. So it was pretty difficult times back in the late 80s, early 90s. There was no professional league to speak of that was producing talent. And so players were really going from the youth environment, pay-to-play clubs, into colleges, and then from college, being selected into various youth national teams, under 23s, etc. One program that existed was a program called Olympic Development, which was, if you were going to do it all over again and you had unlimited funds, it's probably the program you would go with, which was players played for their clubs, they tried out at select basis locally. Then if they made it, they went to more of a regional kind of environment. And then within their state, then they represented their state. And then the states became 4 regions of the country. And then those 4 regions competed, and that's how you generally found your national team. So ODP, Olympic Development Program, was a good idea. The challenge becomes that it's 55 different state associations. A couple of our big states are divided in half. It was pay to play in many cases. So it was incredibly inclusive of those who could afford it and were in geographical convenient, but it really missed out a lot of our lower socioeconomic players, where of course a lot of our talent was. So ODP was imperfect. gosh, I don't know, probably within the last decade, but probably 8-9 years, US Soccer came up with a development academy league, which they managed. So you had US Youth Soccer managing youth leagues, US clubs, some other organizations, AYSO. But US Soccer created an academy league for the biggest clubs in America, almost exclusively congregated around major population hubs. And then the MLS academy sides were in there too. So you had that was probably the pinnacle of our youth development structure. So a lot of clubs that had been very pay-to-play heavy, playing in US youth and US club, came into the US soccer academy structure and competed with the MLS. Now the MLS academies are almost all now fully funded. So you can see that, assuming that the athlete could get close enough to an MLS academy situation, and they have residency programs and they have other homestay programs, the top talent, if the club is paying for it, can come from anywhere. So the socioeconomic issues do become a little bit, or they come, a lot of it is covered. You still struggle where if you've got players in really good populations, let's say Louisiana, where there is no MLS academy. So how does a boy in Louisiana get scouted, and how do they get to the MLS academy? Or a boy in Maine, in upstate New England. So it was an imperfect structure, but it was certainly something. What's happened over time is, and this is why it's a really, really big news here just today in America or in the US, is that the MLS academies were getting increasingly stronger and too strong for the other competition in the academy structure in a lot of cases. And so there was always this threat that the MLS academies would break away and they could fund themselves for the travel needed to play each other. And US Soccer was piling a lot of money into a program, and they were getting all of their national team players from the MLS academies. They weren't really coming from the other academies. The MLS might recruit from the other academies, but ultimately our national teams are almost exclusively MLS developed players, or players in MLS academies. So right now, our structure is the traditional leagues and state, provincial leagues that you have. We have regional leagues, state leagues, national leagues, but the absolute creme de la creme right now is the fully funded MLS academies. That's our current structure. And then just interestingly, one of the main technical guys for MLS is a gentleman called Fred Lipker, a French guy out of the MLS offices in New York. And he is aware that the MLS can only do so much in their scouting. So he is actually collaborating with the old Olympic development program, which continues to this day. And he's asking the Olympic development program to continue to do its work in a lot of the communities where there is no MLS presence, and then bring talent into central places where the MLS scouts can see it. So interestingly, ODP has just got a really big adrenaline shot because MLS sees it as a scouting network for them to tap into. So we're getting there.
Jason, you are with your microphone disconnected.
Sorry.
Okay.
Thank you very much for that very extensive description. Appreciate that. Just with some of the comments you made there about the MLS clubs, David, how do the 3 Canadian MLS clubs influence the high performance leagues within Canada?
I would think it's similar to what is happening in Toronto, but I can give you more information about TFC and how they've worked with the clubs here. They have affiliations with clubs outside of the Greater Toronto Area, which is an hour and a half to 2 hours outside. So they have a club they're affiliated with in London. They have a club they're affiliated with in Ottawa. And I'm pleased to know that they're not going out and making affiliations with clubs inside of Toronto, because I don't think it'd be fair for one club to be, in favor and another club isn't, because we're all fans of TFC. And I think every kid having a hometown team would want to play for TFC. So one of the biggest things that we've done as technical directors as a group in collaboration with TFC is that we promote and push on our best players towards TFC, because eventually, as Ian said, the MLS, I mean, it's free to play for them. they take care of all the expenses and getting into their academy stream and moving on from there. So with our relationship with Pickering FC and TFC has been a good one. And I know that a number of other clubs in the Greater Toronto area also have a good relationship where we try to support the movement of players to them. Obviously, you know, we all like to think that we're the ones that are going to develop the players, but they have the best environment. There is no other club that can compete with TFC when it comes to all the additional support that we won't have, from staffing to medical to video analysis, individual plans that are situated, even homeschool programs that they're connected to. So that's a huge investment that they're making. And they have a $25 million complex that they can house the entire program. So why wouldn't you want your players to move on there? And to be honest, TFC has been excellent in the fact of giving the recognition back to the clubs as well for players that have moved on to TFC, from Bill Manning all the way down through their entire staff to their academy director, Anthony, is that they acknowledge it every step of the way and they never let you forget. And I don't think there is a single technical director that couldn't contact Anthony at TFC and have people come into their facilities to see what and how they operate through the academy. They're open to providing information and helping coaches be educated. We had Anthony at our club just at the beginning of March, and he did a fantastic job to explain to us what his culture was happening in the club and, you know, things that we can adapt. And I don't think it's any different for Vancouver Whitecaps that are out in the West. I'm sure that they're making good relationships with the clubs there. They have a solid academy program where players can be moved to. And Montreal's no different in Quebec. And I can assure you that each of those provinces, each of those cities are supporting their MLS franchise, and I can't say anything negative about that because we can't compete with them.
Thanks, David. That's very encouraging that the professional clubs are being supportive in that way. Ian, I'd like to pass it over to you because, as I'm led to believe, the New York Red Bulls program, the affiliate program, is maybe one of the best in North America. Is there anything additionally you could add about that program on top of what David's just said?
Yeah, I think David hits on something that's fantastic. So the MLS clubs, it makes a lot of sense and good business sense for them to be incredibly appreciative of the work that's happening in the community-based clubs, like, for example, Pickering and the relationship with Toronto FC, because it's very likely that the players are learning the game, their love of the game in their community clubs, and then at some point they get identified as top talent. So that seems to be a very common theme with the MLS clubs. And of course, ultimately they're potentially taking the very best talent out of that club. So that club becomes potentially a little bit less competitive, but what an opportunity for the player. And how great if Toronto can say this was a player that was developed by David or whatever. So one of the things that Red Bull has done, which I think is excellent, they have a sort of essentially an affiliate program, which is big in the MLS in general. They hire about 100 community-based trainers who go out and work with clubs all around the state, and the club pays for that service, but the club doesn't necessarily have to have a paid DOC and as many paid staff. So they outsource through Red Bull, and these community coaches go out. Very professionally done, so very high branding for Red Bull. Obviously, that supports the Red Bull brand and gets people to come and watch the games at the stadium. While they're out there, these affiliate coaches are also evaluating talent. And so there is a multi-step process where the trainers, when they're out working in a community, maybe an hour and a half, couple of hours from Red Bull's central hub, they can see a young player and then they can bring them into an increasing and graduated series of select programs. So it's really a massive win-win because the clubs are getting support, they're getting connected to a professional entity, their players are being evaluated, Red Bull is selling tickets, Red Bull is also identifying talent, and it's not making all the talent necessarily come straight into the academy setting, but it's able to evaluate and develop the talent in a more regional basis. So Red Bull is one example I happen to be very close to. Here in Kansas City, They have a number of clubs which are branded as sporting affiliates, not only in the Kansas City metro area, but in places like Arkansas and Oklahoma. And it's all of this, it's kind of a giant spider web, if you will, and then players gravitating to the center as is merited by their performance.
Thanks, Ian. Just both yourself and David there both made reference to philosophies and systems of play. How challenging is it for the players' pathway to the national teams if clubs are not following the same strategy or philosophy as the national programs? That's to you first, Ian, and then we'll come to you, David.
Yeah. Well, interesting. So a long time ago, when I was taking my A license, a very high-level coach and national team coach called Jay Miller said that the standard model of play in the US is 3-5-2 up until you get to the national team, and Bora Milutinovic does whatever he wants to. Bora Milutinovic was our coach, national coach at the time. Before you had the MLS, I think it was probably quite easy for the federation to slap a game model onto the nation and say, this is what we're looking for. However, if you're picking your talent from the MLS clubs, you can't really seriously go and tell an MLS club what its game model is going to be, because you'd have a very vanilla looking professional league. And of course, we've got so many different influences in our MLS league, from Europe, from South America, different parts of the country alone. So I don't believe that there is that single model. And in a country as diverse as the US, is even tougher, right? Because if we go with a Northern European model, which ties into some of the philosophical things about spirit and hard running and fight and grit and determination, that possibly comes at the elimination of more of a South American, Central American style of player. And then if you go exclusively with that style, and then you take that style down to Costa Rica or Honduras, it's a challenge. And then if you come up to Canada, it's a challenge. So I think I wouldn't want the job of Greg Berhalter in trying to blend it all. But when you look around the MLS, when you look at the reports and some fantastic data on the MLS website, 4-3-3, 4-2-3-1 seems to be very much in vogue. And I don't see a ton of examples when I watch MLS Live with 3 in the back. So 4 in the back seems to be a base, pretty consistent fashion-wise right now. And then what happens to the 6 guys in front of it is really up to anybody's interpretation. So I don't think we have a national style anymore, perhaps the way we did when Bruce Arena was the coach in 2002 and 2006. But you can appreciate why that is, because you're trying to answer so many people that want so many different influences in a country as diverse as the US, which would not dissimilar to Canada as well.
Thanks, Ian. Just David, with the Canadian example, players in your system will be aspiring not only to hopefully arrive at an MLS club, but you've also now got the Canadian Premier League. So how does that impact with the national strategy of how to play the game model compared to the CPL teams and the MLS teams that are striving to compete in their own leagues?
Well, it's not. I don't disagree with what Ian is saying. I mean, John Herdman is putting out, information for all of us across the country, and just recently did a webinar about the vision of the national men's team. And, having been with the national team program, we were always looking at 4-3-3 as being the model to use. But I'd rather not say the things about the national team, but more reflect on what's happening at the under 15, under 17, under 20 national teams, is because the game at the top level will change based on the number of players and where they're coming from and what is necessary to take on another country. But playing at the under 15, 17 level is where the Ontario Player Development League and all the provincial elite leagues are going to be focusing on developing players for the under 15 team and the under 17, and then they'll graduate on into playing for the under 20s. So we've been given a bit of a mandate to look at 4-3-3 being the model to use for the ages of 13 and 14, even up to 15, and then adding on 2 other forms that we can use based on what we wanted as a club identity. But to influence what's happening at Major League Soccer and the national team, I think they will always look at what is necessary for them. And I think every club needs to have their own identity. I think the most important thing is to make sure a player is technically sound, both left feet, right foot, being able to play under pressure, being able to be creative, but making the right decisions. And I think if we open the door for players to learn how to solve problems and having the time on the field with good coaching, they can go to any level. It doesn't matter. You can be picked up at MLS. You can go to the national team. You can go to university. The door is open once you're technically sound. So I think that is the main question for me to focus on, is not worrying about what TFC, Vancouver, or Montreal want, or what the national top senior team wants, but more so working with the youth team coaches in the Excel and Rex programs at the under 15, 17 level, because that'll end up going to the under 20s eventually.
Thanks, David. Just to pull on a point there, you mentioned predominantly about the provision of coaching to the players. How particularly the clubs underneath the club licensing directions, how are clubs now ensuring the coaches are trained, qualified, and have the knowledge, particularly age-appropriate knowledge, to best develop these best players in our program?
Well, one thing I can definitely tell you is that this pause in the game, I believe more people are educating themselves about the game than ever before. I don't think there is a single licensed program that could have involved so many people across the country to research for themselves. And I think that's the big difference. A lot of it is with the fact that it's free, but it's also the fact that people want that information. And so relatively everyone that's been able to offer that is helping every coach in our country. We have the A license and we have the B license, same as it's set up in the US. But I look at what's happened now is our A license is more for coaches that are going to move on to the professional ranks. So more of it's been pushed down to the B license if you want to coach the senior level, League One, under 21, under 20 levels. And the introduction of our national youth license is for those who are going to coach 13 to and up, that it's 11v11. And I think that's really important because it will galvanize our structure, our nation together to be able to understand what does it take to coach 11v11. And then you have another course that is the National Children's License, which is focusing primarily on grassroots, how to keep those kids engaged, how not to always have a full structure program where we tell them every solution, but find ways to engage the player, to think, to problem solve, to work with one another, and just be there as a guide. And that hopefully will start to develop more creative players, more players that can make decisions, that can think for themselves. And it'll be more about the player than it is about the coach. And that's a change that hopefully will happen in our country with these two licenses. And when they get to 11v11, then it's hopefully that as those with the national club licenses will have specialists in age groups that moving from 9v9 to 11v11 at U13, and then to U14, 15, and then, what's the elite level at 16, 17, 18 years of age to get into the senior level or off to university or under 20 national teams. But it's a big change that's happening in our country. And a lot of people will say, well, not another license, but it's more relevant to our country. We can't keep comparing ourselves to the Europeans. We can't compare ourselves to the United States. We are unique in the size of our country, with the size of the population, with the majority of players in the biggest cities. And we've got to get everybody involved, from those kids who can afford to play and those kids who are in the inner city kids who can't. And we need coaches to be educated in the new way of learning, not the past of what perhaps I've grown up with or Ian or yourself have grown up with. There's new ways to teach, and we've got to take that from the educational program and apply it into coaching, because I prefer not saying coaching anymore and more about teaching. And our jobs as technical leaders is to open the eyes of the coaches from the old generation and support the new generation that it's all about the kids. And they're smarter and they're more visual learners. They've got Google at their hands. They can research. They can YouTube things. So we've got to tap into the technology in order to help our kids learn better. And I think it's been an absolute crash course these past 5 weeks of the technology that most people are afraid to use. have gotten a lesson on it into saying virtual classrooms, virtual instructors. So it's something. It's special, and it's an opportunity for us to all reset the button for this game and change the landscape.
Definitely agree with that, David. And I think a great example of that transition and how positive impact the age-appropriate learning streams are.
Yeah.
The English game is a great example that maybe 10 years ago they started the age-appropriate programs, and now the English academy system and the coaching methodology is vastly different. So as long as people are patient with it, I think Canada will see a really good effect from introducing those streams.
That's the key there, Jason. It's the patience, right? We're in a society that wants everything quickly, and we forget that, you know, in sports we have to look at the education system, that you can only learn so much at a certain age, that you can only absorb so much information, and then you learn in stages. And the game has to be considered in the same way. And unfortunately, that, you know, we're all guilty. I was guilty as well, is that we put winning before development. And slowly that mindset has to change if we want to compete with the rest of the world, or even close the gap, let's say, not even compete with the rest of the world, but close the gap. And we would go from there by learning from the past mistakes and changing the way we think.
It's good you mentioned the winning and development conundrum, because Ian, I believe tomorrow you're on the panel of that discussion. Is that correct?
Assuming the internet works in Kansas City, Missouri. Yeah.
Absolutely. Ian, I want to come back to something you mentioned earlier. If our high performance leagues are having the best players within them, talent ID and recruitment is a really important part. Now, I believe the US governing bodies have introduced a talent identification program in the last couple of years of educating people within the industry. I'm not sure if it's coming to Canada yet, but how in the US high performance leagues are teams recruiting and identifying the best players?
Yeah, I would say that kind of along David's lines, every club is its own entity, right? So if you have an Argentine manager and he even cares enough to give information back down to the academy, because sometimes there's a disconnect from the first team to the academy, but it's going to be program to program, be it the academy director, the director of football, possibly the head coach of the senior team, that are making those influences on what to look for. US Soccer has developed a talent identification coaching award, a scouting award, if you will. So they're starting to unveil that. But much like the EPPP in England, this comes from a federation, and it may not be adopted necessarily by individual high performance environments. They may have their own. And then, of course, right now, our scouting award is not really accessible to the community clubs that arguably might need it even more, right? You might actually offer it to the grassroots or the intermediate level before you offer it to the top level. But this becomes a challenge. Imminent domain, so it's very difficult for an MLS club to have enough scouts with enough detail. And I also think that there's a gentleman, Gerald Griggs from Great Britain, has been tapping in and asking some questions. In one of our youth organizations alone, just one of them, US Youth Soccer, they have about 2.7 million children playing. US Club has possibly 600,000, and then you've got AYSO, Park and Rec, you've got all of these kids. And at times, you could go to a park and see 1,000 players in a US soccer, soccer in the US tournament. How the heck are you meant to really get around enough to pick that special player? So we have a challenging filtering system, and that's why, again, the Olympic development program in concept, not necessarily in execution, is the right way to go. So that 9-10-year-old that's in Pickering, after it's been demonstrated for a number of weeks that he or she is performing at a certainly high level, they leave Pickering once or twice a week to train with some kids from neighboring communities. And then if that group's doing well, they become East Ontario or East Toronto, and they play West Toronto. For me, that laddering system, so that the scouts don't have to go out and beat all of the bushes. I mean, there's stories of George Best and these miracle player identifications, and those are cute stories. But ultimately, the best scouts need to be placed and have a group of players in front of them that have been filtered through. So I think everybody is part of the process, and there needs to be, and the US is trying to get there, where any coach can recommend a player, and then that player can be recommended on and on and on through a series of sub-scouts and local scouts and get there. So, you know, it's something we need to evolve. But if you can get across Belgium, which is what, 300 kilometers in a couple of hours, and you know, LA to, or Portland, Oregon, or Seattle to Fort Lauderdale, that's a long drive for sure.
Thanks, Ian. That's, I think, a key thing you make is the geographical challenge, and just coming over to you, David, and following from Gerald Griggs's comment is, how would the governing bodies in Canada support clubs like yours in talent identification and recruiting the best players into these national licensed clubs now?
Well, I'm not sure that it would be the fact of us as a club that might have a national club license to be going out and recruiting players from all over as a club, because I think the most important thing is to develop your own identity and be able to develop the players within your own community. I think if you develop the players in your own community, that's less travel, less of a headache to any parent, or financial burden on a family that's going to move from our club and trying to drive, you know, an hour away to play with another club. And I think it's important that every club looks at their technical leadership and look at a coach education and the infrastructure that we're building. But moving from there through your grassroots, you know, it's not necessarily that it's always a coach that makes a player. It's the intrinsic ability of a player that wants it more than somebody else that eventually will rise to the occasion. It's just the opportunity to be scouted. So from there at U13, if you end up in the OPDL, it's the talented pathway. So there are scouts from the Provincial Association. There are now relationships with the technical leaders of each club talking to the scouts. But this year was also an interesting point that now as coaches from the teams, you recommend players from other teams, not necessarily your own, so that you try to remove that political element that sometimes, you know, you want to promote just your own players. And so that will lead into being identified into the provincial programs, which then the MLS clubs will come in and have a look at those players. The Rex program that's in each one of the provinces, either if it's a Rex program or Super Rex that it's in Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver, will identify those players that, you know, now need more hours with more coaching, with more identification in alignment of the national vision. So they'll go with those coaches, and it's a team job. That when a player, for example, Jade makes it from Pickering to the senior women's team, it's not one individual person, it's not one individual team, but a collaborative group of effort of everybody being part of that journey. And I think if people looked at it that way, there would be more satisfaction of more players making it to the top. So the scouting system is in stages, but it's not perfect. Definitely not. There are so many players that get overlooked. I think in Canada, players develop at a later age than at the early ages. And I think that the players that are overlooked at 13, 14, 15 should still keep confident about the abilities that they will evolve and still have opportunities at 17, 18, 19, 20. And I think sometimes we forget that. And sometimes, even as scouts, we forget to go back and revisit the ones that we have not identified at an early age group.
Thanks, David. Just looking at the questions there, I think Gerald Griggs and Danny Walker both have questions that link to what you said, but I'm actually going to hand it to Ian to answer. So Gerald mentioned how do we kind of how do we pick up late developers in our systems, but Danny also mentions about how do we bridge that gap for these players to get into first teams. Ian, I'll hand that one to you.
Yeah. So the late developer one is very interesting. I believe that, so right now in the US, we're on a birth year. So you're a 2005 or 2006. Absolutely, we need to have a first team of 2005s, and then we need to have a second team of 2005s, which is exclusively the July to December birth dates. So that way, you're absolutely keeping around the kids who are perhaps physically a little bit less mature for that 6-month age difference. Maybe they've had 6 months less of soccer simply because of the birth year. So the first thing I would do is make sure that as you're building your age group size, you pay special attention to the inclusion of the July through December half of the year. And the example of that would be the Belgium Federation, because the Belgians have national teams from U14, 15 up. And then they have what they call the futures team, which is anybody they deem to be potential, but just can't handle it physically. So I'm a big proponent of those kind of inclusive type programs. I mean, I don't completely know the story of Messi, but Messi probably would have got cut in a lot of North American youth environments just because he was so small and couldn't win games at 8 or 9 or 10, maybe, because he wasn't big enough. As far as the Phil Foden not getting enough games at Man City, this to me is a big concern. We're lucky in this country now. We have a very developing tier of leagues under MLS, called the USL. So players can go down into USL, but it is some of the MLS teams have them as reserve teams. Other times they'll loan players out, but it's akin to playing in the Championship in England or League One or League Two. So it's not ideal. I could make the case that it would help US soccer development and the development of US players that could play for our national team, if we had some modest guidelines in MLS that said you must have at least so many homegrown players, not just on the roster, but actually participating. Because it's quite easy for MLS clubs to go into Central and South America and get very, very good talent at a very affordable price and bring them into the league. And then the academy players are sitting there waiting for their opportunity, a la Phil Foden. So, you know, I don't know whether MLS has that ability and whether US soccer has the ability to put pressure in there. But I think one of the ways you would have to do it is you'd actually have to require the clubs to play the development, the academy players, as part of the structure. Maybe we have a FA Cup, it's called the Open Cup, and maybe that is the competition where it is required. So it would be a slow boil. But of course, you know, as you would know, Danny, for many years, there have been lineups now in the Premiership where there haven't been English-based players or English-eligible players on the roster. So the Premier League, the best product in the world, one of the best products in the world, but it isn't necessarily helping the development of English talent all the time, not necessarily.
Thanks, Ian. I'm just conscious of time. We've got maybe about 90 seconds left. I just wanted to say to everyone that's viewing in, I know both Ian and David have been happy enough to provide their email addresses and social media names. So, guys, what might be good if you can maybe put them into the live comments section so the guys could see them in there, that would be beneficial. Just
that is not an option for us, Jason.
We can do that. Okay, I'm not sure the best way we can do it.
Put it on the screen.
Don't worry, I can do that. I will introduce. I will go get in the private chat, and I will introduce it on the.
That's great. Thank
live chat. Okay.
I just want to finish off just by thanking both Ian and Dave for joining us today with the National Soccer Coaches Association of Canada online debates in association with Soccer Hub. I think this has been a truly interesting topic and one that I'm sure we could speak over for many hours. But Dave, Ian, thanks very much for your time today. Really appreciate your input and your insight, and glad we all got over our technical issues. So thank you very much.
Great job, Jason. Well done.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Ricardo.
You too, Ian.
Thanks for all the people.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Ricardo.
Nice to hear you guys. Nice discussion. See you soon. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.